They say the only thing harder than leaving the West is coming back to face what you left behind. Caleb Montgomery didn't ride back to Purgatory Creek looking for forgiveness. He came to bury a father who despised him and sell off the dusty acres that tore his family apart. He expected a fight with the bank. He expected a town that had forgotten his name. But when he kicked open that door, he didn't find emptiness. He found her, Lorena. The woman who shattered his heart 10 years ago, standing in the hallway, holding a loaded Winchester, and hiding a secret that would turn the entire Wyoming territory upside down. She married another man 6 months after he left. He spent a decade hating her for it. But what if everything he believed was a lie? What if someone stole their letters? What if her father sold her to the highest bidder? And what if the only way to save each other now is to fight side by side against a man who will kill them both for the gold buried beneath their feet? This is not a fairy tale. This is a story of betrayal, buried treasure, and a love that refused to die in the dust. This story reminds us that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried. Sometimes the people we spent years hating were victims too. And the greatest treasure in life isn't gold or land. It's finding someone worth fighting for. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment below and tell me. Do you believe Caleb made the right choice to stay and fight? Your thoughts mean the world to this channel. Hit that like button if you felt something today. And subscribe so you never miss another story from the frontier. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to fight for love. The wind out in Wyoming territory did more than just blow. It clawed at you. It threw high desert grit in your face, peeling paint right off the wood and scouring the hope clean out of a man. Caleb Montgomery tipped the brim of his Stetson down. His eyes narrowed against the stinging dust as his horse, a gelding he called Jericho, came over the last ridge. Down below him was the Double M Ranch. From that far off, it just looked like a bad scar on the land. The main house, which used to be a fine two-story place all painted white, was now a peeling gray, leaning a little to the west like it was just plain tired of fighting the wind. The fences around the corral had more gaps than teeth, and the windmill was moaning with a terrible metal shriek that carried all the way up the canyon, a lonely, steady cry of pure neglect. Caleb shifted in his worn leather saddle. He was 32 years old, but the last 10 years pushing cattle from Texas to Montana had carved 40 years of hard living into his face. He had a Colt Peacemaker hanging on his hip, its finish worn smooth from being used, not from being shown off. He wasn't what you'd call a gunslinger, but out in the territories, the only thing between a cowboy and a killer was usually someone pushing him too far. He hadn't set foot on this property since the night of the fire, the same night he and his father, Elias Montgomery, had come to blows. Caleb had ridden away from that fight with a split lip and a promise to himself that he would never come back. But now, Elias was gone. A heart attack, the telegram said. A lonely end for a hard, bitter man. "Easy now, Jericho," Caleb said quietly, guiding the horse down the winding trail, the town of Purgatory. Creek was 5 miles to the east, but Caleb wasn't in any hurry to see other people just yet. He wanted to look over what was now his. He needed to see if there was anything left to save, or if he should just sign the whole mess over to the bank and head north for good. As he rode up into the yard, the quiet was heavy, like a wool blanket in the summer. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the thick, choking silence that comes when a place has been abandoned. Weeds stood waist-high all around the porch. An old plow, rusted through, was half sunk in the dirt, looking like the bones of some long-dead creature. Caleb swung down from his horse, tying Jericho to the one good rail left on the hitching post. He walked up the porch steps, his boots making a heavy, hollow sound on the warped boards. He reached for the doorknob, which felt cold and rough in his hand, and gave it a push. The door groaned open on dry hinges. The air that hit him was stale, like it had been trapped in there for years. But underneath the smell of dust and old tobacco smoke, there was another scent. It was a smell that hit Caleb right in the gut. Lavender and beeswax. He stopped cold, his hand dropping down to the grip of his pistol without him even thinking about it. That smell had no business being in this house. It belonged to a memory, one he'd spent a solid decade trying to forget with cheap whiskey and backbreaking work. "Who's in here?" he called out, his voice sounding rough. Out of the shadows of the front parlor, a person appeared. She moved into a single beam of afternoon sun slicing through a filthy window, and all the air went right out of Caleb's chest. She had on a black morning dress with a collar so high and stiff it looked severe, but that dress couldn't hide the fire burning in her green eyes. She was older for sure. The softness she had as a girl was gone, replaced by the sharp edges of a woman who had learned how to survive on the frontier. But she was still the most beautiful woman Caleb had ever laid eyes on, and she was aiming a double-barreled shotgun right at the middle of his chest. "You're on private property," she said. Her voice was as steady and cold as a mountain stream. "Lorena," Caleb breathed out, completely ignoring the gun. Lorena Bishop. She had been Lorena Sterling, the girl he was supposed to marry. The girl who swore she would wait for him, and the very same girl who married Jedediah Bishop, the richest merchant in town, just 6 months after Caleb rode away. "I said you're trespassing," she said again, but the barrels of that shotgun trembled just a little. "Tell me your business or get off my land." "My business?" Caleb let out a harsh, dry laugh. "I'm Caleb Montgomery. This was my father's house. I reckon that makes it my land now." Lorena didn't lower the gun. "Elias is dead, Caleb. We buried him 3 days ago up on the hill. You weren't here." "I was 3 states away when I got the wire," Caleb said, taking one slow step closer. "Put the gun down, Lorena. You know I'm not here to cause you any trouble." "I don't know a thing about you anymore," she snapped back. "The Caleb I knew wouldn't have left his own father to rot alone in this house for 10 long years. "That man made his own bed," Caleb growled, feeling that old anger rise up in him. "And I made mine. But that doesn't change the law. I'm his only son. Now, what are you doing in my house pointing a shotgun at me? Did Jedediah send you over to square up a debt my father owed him?" When he said her husband's name, Lorena's face changed. A look of pure pain, raw and deep, flashed across her eyes. She slowly lowered the shotgun, resting it against a dusty old armchair. "Jedediah is dead, Caleb," she said, her voice soft. "He passed on last winter. Influenza." Caleb stood there for a moment. The anger left him, and all he felt was a confusing sort of sympathy. I didn't know. I'm sorry to hear that." "Don't be," she said, pushing a stray piece of auburn hair out of her face. "He was a good man, better than most." She looked Caleb over from head to toe, taking in the dust on his coat and the gun on his hip. "And as for why I'm here, I'm not here to collect a debt, Caleb. I live here." Caleb just stared. "You what?" "I moved in 6 months ago. I was taking care of Elias." The whole room felt like it was tilting. "You? Taking care of my father? He couldn't stand the Sterlings. He couldn't stand anybody. He was sick, Caleb, and he was all alone. Somebody had to." She walked over to the big oak desk in the corner, the place where Elias used to run everything from, and she picked up a thick envelope that was sealed with red wax. "You think you can just ride back in here, brush the dust off your coat, and sell this place to whoever offers the most?" Lorena asked, holding the envelope out to him. "You really think it's going to be that easy?" "It ought to be," Caleb said, looking at the envelope like it might bite him. "I'm his son." "Read it," she challenged him. Caleb took the envelope. He broke the seal, his rough fingers feeling clumsy. He pulled out the paper inside and recognized the fancy handwriting of Judge Thaddeus O'Malley, the only lawyer for 100 miles. He skimmed through the legal words, his eyes jumping down to the part that said last will and testament. "I, Elias Montgomery, being of sound mind, do hereby leave the Double M Ranch, including all the animals, water rights, and buildings." Caleb stopped reading. He read that line a second time and then a third. "This can't be right," he mumbled. "Oh, it's right," Lorena said, crossing her arms. He changed it 2 weeks before he died. The will did not leave the ranch to Caleb, not all of it. To be split evenly between my estranged son, Caleb Montgomery, and my caretaker and companion, Lorena Bishop, on the condition that for 1 full year they both live on and work the land to make it profitable again. If either one of them should leave or fail to do their part, their half will go to the other. Caleb looked up, the paper trembling in his hand. He chained us together. He knew you would try to sell it and leave, Lorena said, her voice not sounding the least bit happy about it. And he knew that after the bank took Jedediah's store, I didn't have anywhere else to go. He did this to us on purpose, Caleb. Elias is still pulling our strings even from his own grave. Caleb looked around the decaying room, then at the woman who had stomped on his heart, and then down at the piece of paper that had just locked them both in a cage built by his father's spite. I won't do it, Caleb declared. I'll fight it in court. You can try, Lorena answered. But the bank, the cattlemen's exchange from Cheyenne, they're coming to inspect the place this Friday. If we don't have a working plan to manage this ranch by then, they'll foreclose on the loans Elias took out. We'll lose it all. You'll lose what's yours, and I'll lose the only roof I have over my head. She took a step toward him, her green eyes locking with his. You ran away from here once, Caleb. Are you going to run away again? Or are you going to stay and fight for it? The silence after Lorena laid down that challenge just hung in the dusty air like smoke after a gunfight. Caleb stared right back at her, and he could see the tiredness around her eyes and the roughness of her hands. Those hands used to play the piano, but now they were calloused from hard work. How much? Caleb asked, his voice low. How much is the loan? Lorena walked over to the window and stared out at the weed-choked yard. $3,000. Elias borrowed it to dig new wells back in the drought of '81. He never hit water. The money just vanished. $3,000. That was a king's ransom. A cowboy made $30 a month if he was lucky. To pay that off, they were going to need a miracle or find a gold mine. And who's holding the note? Caleb asked. Brogan Hayes. That name hit the air hard. Brogan Hayes wasn't a banker. He was a wolf. He got his start rustling cattle back in the '70s, used blood money to make himself look respectable, and now he practically owned the whole valley north of Purgatory Creek. If Hayes was holding that note, he didn't want the money. He wanted the land, and what he really wanted were the water rights to the creek that ran right through the Double M. Hayes, Caleb said, rubbing his jaw. If Hayes wants this place, he's not going to just wait for us to fail. He'll give us a push. He already has, Lorena said quietly. 2 weeks ago, somebody cut the northern fence line. Fence. We lost 20 head of cattle. Elias, the stress of it all is what finally took him. A cold fire started burning in Caleb's chest. His father may have been a hard man, but he was a Montgomery, and hounding someone into an early grave was just another name for murder. I need to find O'Malley, Caleb said, stuffing the will into his coat. I have to make sure this document is rock solid. It is, Lorena assured him, but you go on into town. Just remember, Caleb, the guest room is down at the end of the hall. Do not even think about using Elias's room. I haven't cleared out his belongings yet. I am not staying here, Caleb said without thinking. The will states you have to live on the property, she reminded him gently. Tonight is the first night. Caleb swore under his breath, spun around, and stalked out of the house. The long ride to Purgatory Creek was a storm of anger and planning. The town looked about the same, the rising sun. Saloon was still begging for a new coat of paint. The general store's sign was still hanging crooked, but a new tension hung in the air, a watchfulness in the eyes of folks as he rode down the main street. He hitched Jericho in front of the lawyer's office, a little brick building right next to the sheriff's. Judge Thaddeus P. O'Malley was a fellow who looked like a walrus poured into a cheap suit. He was sipping a glass of cherry cordial when Caleb stormed in. Caleb! O'Malley gasped, not bothering to getting to his feet. I got word you were back in town. I am sorry about your pa. Save the pleasantries, Thaddeus. Caleb slapped the will down on the desk. Tell me this is some kind of joke. Did he truly give half this ranch to her? Ali polished his glasses. It is all legal and binding, son. The sheriff and I both saw him sign it. Your father was set on it. He believed he had a massive debt to settle with Mrs. Bishop. A debt? Caleb paced the cramped office. She up and married the very man who drove me out of my own business. Thaddeus. What in the world could Elias have owed her? Ali sighed, pouring another glass of cherry wine and sliding it over to Caleb. Have a seat, son. There's a whole lot you do not know. Things that went on long after you rode away. Caleb remained standing. Start talking. After Jedediah passed, Lorena was left with absolutely nothing. The bank, which was Hayes's bank, seized the house, the general store, everything. She ended up sleeping in the livery. Your father discovered her there, and he brought her home. She cooked his meals, she cleaned that disaster of a house, and she read to him when his eyesight started to fail. She became the daughter he always wished he had, Caleb, the one who did not leave. The words cut deep. Caleb threw back the cherry cordial in a single swallow. And Hayes, Caleb asked, does he know about this whole arrangement? Oh, he knows, O'Malley confirmed with a grim nod. And he is not pleased. He figured he would foreclose the second Elias was in the ground. With you here, the will ties this land up in court for at least a year, provided you work it. So, Hayes is stalled for the time being. O'Malley leaned in close, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You watch your back, Caleb. Hayes brought in a new foreman. A fellow by the name of Sluss. No, hold on. Scratch that. The man's name is Vargo, a gunfighter from down in Mexico. A real nasty character. I can deal with gunfighters, Caleb stated, turning for the door. It is not just about guns, Caleb, O'Malley warned. It is about the past. You and Lorena. This town has a long memory, and secrets have a bad habit of festering out in the open, Caleb rode, back toward the ranch, while the sun bled out behind the sharp peaks of the Tetons, staining the sky with shades of purple and red. As he neared the homestead, he could see smoke curling up from the chimney. A warm yellow light shone from the kitchen window. It looked welcoming. It felt like a trap. He put Jericho in the stable, rubbing him down with some dry straw. As he headed for the house, he saw something by the barn door. Fresh tracks in the dirt, but they were not from a horse. They were boot prints. Somebody had been standing right there, watching the house, knowing Lorena was inside all by herself. Caleb pulled his peacemaker, creeping quietly toward the porch. He eased the front door open. Lorena was at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables. A stew was simmering on the stove. She glanced up when he came in, her face looking drawn and pale. You have returned, she said. We've had company, Caleb said, sliding his pistol back into its holster, but keeping his hand close by. There are tracks by the barn. Lorena's knife stopped mid-slice on a carrot. Hayes, or maybe that man of his, Vargo. Lorena set the knife on the counter. Her hands were shaking. Caleb, there is something more you should know. About why Elias needed that loan. About why he was so desperate to find water. He was a cattleman, Lorena. Cattlemen always need water. No. She shook her head. She reached into the pocket of her apron and took out a small, heavy bundle wrapped in an old cloth. She put it on the table and carefully unwrapped it. A piece of rock lay inside. It was quartz, with a thick, jagged streak of a dull yellow metal running through it. Caleb lifted it. The weight of it was surprising. He made a scratch on the metal with his thumbnail. It left a deep gouge. Gold. He discovered it in the dry creek bed 3 years ago, Lorena whispered. That is the real reason he wanted the wells. He was not searching for water, Caleb. He was trying to find the mother lode. He was convinced the source was buried deep in the earth. Caleb just stared at the piece of gold. This changed the entire game. This was never about cattle or water rights if Hayes got wind of this. Does anybody else know about this? Caleb asked, his voice strained. Only Elias and myself. And now, you. She hesitated, taking a shaky breath. But the week before he passed, Elias was not in his right mind. He was shouting about finding gold. The window was open, the doctor was here, and so was his assistant. Who is the assistant? A young man named Toby. He likes to drink at the saloon. He has a loose tongue. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut. The cat was out of the bag. Hayes did not just want the land for his cattle. He wanted the gold mine, and he would not hesitate to kill them both to get it. In that very instant, the kitchen window exploded into 1,000 pieces. A bullet slammed into the tabletop mere inches from the gold nugget, making splinters fly. Lorena screamed and hit the floor. Caleb kicked the table over, pushing Lorena behind it just as a second shot took out the lantern, throwing the room into complete darkness. "Get down and stay down," Caleb yelled, his Colt already in his hand. From the blackness outside, a high, wheezing laugh echoed. "Welcome on back, cowboy." The siege on the Double M ranch had started. The kitchen was a confusing mess of shadows and moonlight. Broken glass crunched under Caleb's boots as he crawled toward the solid oak door that led into the hall. "Keep your head down," he hissed to Lorena. Another gunshot exploded from the yard, the flash from the barrel lighting up the night for a fraction of a second. The bullet tore through the thin wall of the house, kicking up a cloud of plaster dust. They were just trying to keep him pinned down. They were trying to keep his head down while they moved in closer. "They are making a move for the door," Caleb whispered. He could make out the heavy sound of boots on the porch. Lorena did not scream. Much to Caleb's surprise, she did not even shed a tear. In the dim light, he could see her crawling to the corner where she had put the double-barreled shotgun. "Is that thing loaded?" Caleb asked, his voice low and urgent. "Buckshot in both barrels," she answered, her voice trembling but firm. "Good. You watch the back door. If that door opens, do not stop to ask questions. You just pull the triggers." Caleb risked a peek over the windowsill. He saw two shadows moving out by the water trough. A third was already on the porch. He pulled back the hammer of his peacemaker. He let out a slow breath, trying to calm the fire that was racing through his veins. Crack! Caleb fired. The man on the porch cried out and stumbled backward, grabbing at his shoulder. A stream of curses cut through the night, a mix of Spanish and English. "Vargo!" the injured man yelled. "He's fighting back!" "Burn it down!" a voice called out from the dark tree line. "Burn them out of there!" A sharp, cold fear shot through Caleb's gut. A gunfight was one thing he could manage, but a fire in a dry wooden house in the middle of a long drought was a death warrant. "Lorena, the cellar," Caleb ordered. "Go now." "I will not leave you," she shouted back. "They are about to set the house on fire. Get to the root cellar. The door is outside, around the back of the house. I will give you cover." "No." She crawled over to him and grabbed his arm. Her grip was much stronger than he expected. "The trapdoor in the pantry. It goes down to the old storm shelter. We can just wait for them to leave." Caleb did not waste time arguing. He fired 2 more rounds blindly through the window to keep the attackers busy. Then he took Lorena's hand. They hurried into the pantry, a small closet that smelled like onions and old wood. Lorena kicked a rug out of the way, showing an iron ring on the floor. She pulled it up with a grunt. The dark opening below smelled like damp soil. "Get inside," she told him. "You first," Caleb urged, giving her a gentle push. She disappeared into the blackness. Caleb dropped in right after her, pulling the heavy trapdoor closed over their heads just as they heard the sound of more breaking glass and the whoosh of a lit oil lamp being thrown into the parlor. They stayed huddled together in the tight, dark space of the storm shelter. It was just a hole in the ground, barely 5 feet high, with shelves full of canned peaches and pickles. Above them, they could hear heavy boots stomping around the kitchen. Where did they go? Vargo's voice was muffled, but they could hear him through the floorboards. "They are gone. Maybe they went out the back." "Find the gold," Vargo bellowed. "Tear this entire place apart." Caleb could feel Lorena shaking beside him. He put an arm around her, holding her close to his chest. He could feel her heart pounding against him like a trapped bird. In the frightening closeness of the dark, all the years they had been apart seemed to just vanish. She smelled like gunpowder now, mixed with the faint scent of lavender. Their heads? Furniture was being thrown over. Dishes were being smashed. The heavy footsteps walked back and forth just inches from their heads. "Boss, the fire is out. The wood near the porch is too damp." "Forget the fire," Vargo growled. "We have made our point. If they are not dead, they are plenty scared. Let them sit with their fear for a night. We control the darkness. We will come back." The sound of footsteps faded. They heard horses neigh and then gallop away, the sounds slowly disappearing into the endless quiet of the prairie. Caleb did not. He didn't dare move for what felt like an eternity. His arm stayed wrapped around Lena, his chin resting gently on her head. "They're gone," he finally breathed out. "At last." Lena took a shaky breath and stepped away, scraping a match against the rough stone wall. The sudden burst of flame lit up her face, which was streaked with grime and unshed tears. "They know about the gold," she said, her voice an empty echo. "They're not going to stop." "No," Caleb agreed, his expression dark. "They sure won't. And that means we can't hole up here," he continued. "Not anymore." He took a long look at the woman he'd been forced to leave. In the dancing light of the match, he saw the faint white scar on her chin. He couldn't recall it. He noticed how her hands were balled up into tight fists. "Why did you stay, Lorena?" The question tumbled out of his mouth before he could catch it. "Why stay with Elias? He was a brute to you." Lena blew out the match, throwing them back into complete darkness. "Because," she whispered from the pitch black, "he was the last piece of you I had left." The silence that fell between them was heavier than all the dirt and rock above their heads. Caleb reached through the dark until his fingers found her hand. He gave it a single firm squeeze. She squeezed right back. For that one night, deep in the cold heart of the earth, they had a truce. The ghosts of their past were still hovering nearby. But for the first time in 10 long years, they weren't facing them all alone. The sun rose over the Double M Ranch like a fresh bruise, all purple and gray. Caleb shoved the heavy trapdoor open and pulled himself out, his whole body stiff and sore. The kitchen was an absolute disaster. Flour coated the floorboards like a layer of dust. The table was flipped on its side and the chairs were busted, but the old house was still standing. Lena followed him up, brushing the dirt from her black dress. She scanned the wreckage and her face hardened into a mask of resolve. She walked to the stove, righted the coffee pot, and by some miracle, saw it was still in one piece. "I'll make some coffee," she declared. It was a strangely normal thing to say in the middle of all that chaos, but Caleb knew what she meant. It was her way of fighting back. "You can wreck my home, but you can't break my spirit." "I'm heading into town," Caleb announced, checking the rounds in his Colt revolver. "I need to wire the marshal over in Cheyenne, but I don't reckon he'll ride all this way for a little squabble over a ranch. And I've got to see Hayes." "Hayes?" Lena whipped around to face him. "You can't just walk into the wolf's den, Caleb. Vargo will be there for sure. If I don't go to him, he'll figure we're scared and hiding. I need to look that man right in the eye. Fellas like Hayes, they get stronger on other people's fear. I have to show him I'm not afraid." "Take the buckboard," she told him. We're low on supplies. We need boards for the windows, nails, and more ammunition. "I'm staying right here," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Somebody has to watch over this land, and I need to go bury the gold." Caleb gave a slow nod. He dug into his pocket and pulled out the heavy gold nugget. He placed it in her hand. "Hide it somewhere deep, Lena. Someplace you'd figure even I wouldn't think to look." Purgatory Creek was already humming with activity by the time Caleb steered the wagon onto Main Street. The morning sun shone brightly, a stark contrast to the violence of the night before. He hitched the horses in front of the general store, but instead of heading inside, he crossed the dusty street toward the building with the shiny brass sign that read, Hayes and Combs Bank and Land Trust. He pushed his way through the big double doors. Inside, the bank was cool and quiet and smelled of fresh paper and ink. A young clerk glanced up, surprised by Caleb's rough appearance. "I'm here to see Bron Hayes," Caleb said loudly. "Mr. Hayes is occupied." "I'll wait." A smooth, deep voice drifted down from the balcony office overhead. Bron Hayes came down the staircase. He was a big man, squeezed into a suit that likely cost more than the whole Double M ranch. He wore a thick mustache and had eyes as hard and gray as river stones. He didn't look like a common cattle thief anymore. He looked like a politician. "Caleb Montgomery." Hayes offered a smile and held out his hand. Caleb ignored it. "I heard you were back in town. Awful business about your father." "Cut the act, Bron," Caleb's voice echoed in the quiet bank. "Your man Vargo paid us a call last night." Hayes's smile never wavered, but a chill crept into his eyes. "Vargo is a passionate employee. He can sometimes get a little carried away with his security duties. I can promise you I don't know anything about any illegal goings-on. He shot up my house. He tried to set it on fire." "Did he now?" Hayes clicked his tongue. "Sounds like a rough welcome home. Maybe this territory's a bit too wild for you, Caleb. You've been gone for a good while. Times have changed. The bank is always prepared to take that troublesome property off your hands. I can make you a fair offer for the deed this very minute. More than enough to get you back to Texas with money in your pocket." "I'm not selling." Caleb took a step forward. "And if Vargo shows his face on my land again, I won't just send him packing with a warning. I'll tie him to his own horse, belly down." Hayes leaned in close, his voice dropping to a low whisper meant only for Caleb. "You're holding a losing hand, son. The lien on your property is due in 4 days, and even if you find the money, accidents are known to happen. Wells go dry, barns catch fire, and widows, well, they have such a delicate nature." Caleb grabbed Hayes by the front of his expensive suit, slamming him back against the teller's cage. The clerk let out a gasp. "You lay one hand on her," Caleb growled, "and I will burn this bank to the ground with you still inside it." "Sheriff!" Hayes yelled, not looking the least bit frightened. The front door swung open, and a large shadow fell across them. Sheriff Big Jim Taggart stood in the doorway, his thumbs hooked casually in his gun belt. He looked tired, and his badge was dull with tarnish. "Let him go, Caleb," Taggart said in a weary voice. Caleb let go of Hayes and straightened his own coat. "Tell your boss to keep his men off my property, Jim." "I'm the law in this town, Caleb," Taggart warned, though he couldn't seem to look Caleb in the eye. "Don't you go starting a war you can't hope to win." "The war already started," Caleb shot back, then turned and stalked out of the bank. Caleb used the last of his cash for supplies, lumber, nails, coffee, flour, and 3 whole boxes of .45 caliber cartridges. While he was loading up the wagon, a hand landed hard on his shoulder. He spun fast, his own hand dropping to his gun. It was a man with one eye and a noticeable limp, who smelled like horse liniment and cheap rye whiskey. "Easy on that trigger," the man chuckled. "You always were a jumpy one." Jubal. A real grin spread across Caleb's face. Jubal Early had been the foreman on the Double M back when Caleb was just a boy. He was an old man now, his face a road map of deep wrinkles, but he was still on his feet. "Heard you were back," Jubal said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the street. "Also heard you raised a ruckus over at the bank." "That was probably foolish. Good to see you too, Jubal." "You're gonna need help out there," Jubal said, his tone turning serious. "Vargo's got 10 men riding for him. All you've got is a widow and a well-used revolver. I can't afford to pay you, Jubal. I ain't asking for pay. I've got my own score to settle with Hayes, myself. He ran my brother off his farm last year." Besides, Jubal glanced over at the fully loaded wagon. I always did like that Lena. She's got more grit than you ever deserved. Grab your things, Caleb said. We're leaving in 10 minutes. The journey back to the ranch was quiet. Jubal sat beside Caleb with a Winchester rifle resting across his lap. As they pulled into the yard, the sun was just starting to dip below the horizon. Lena was on the front porch, hammering a fresh board over a shattered window. She stopped her work when she saw Jubal, and a true smile broke across her tired face. "You old goat," she hollered. "I figured you were dead and buried by now." "Too stubborn to die, Miss Lena," Jubal said, tipping his hat to her. Later that evening, after Jubal had volunteered for the first watch out in the barn, Caleb found Lena sitting on the porch. The air was finally cooling, and the cicadas were buzzing their constant electric song. "Jubal's a good man," she said, her gaze fixed on the darkening plains. "He is." Caleb leaned up against the porch railing. "I was asking around in town today about Jedediah." Lorena went still. "And what did the town gossips have to say?" "They said he bought up all your father's debt, that he threatened to throw your whole family out on the street unless you agreed to marry him." Lena turned to face him, her eyes blazing with old anger. "Is that what you believe? That I was sold off like cattle?" "I don't know what to believe, Lena. All I know is I wrote you a letter every single week for a year. I told you I was working, saving up every penny to send for you, and then one day I got a letter back saying you were now Mrs. Bishop." "You wrote to me?" Lena's voice was a broken whisper. "Caleb, I swear I never received a single one of your letters." Caleb felt like he'd been punched. "What?" "I waited," she said, the tears finally starting to fall. "I sat on this very porch every single day for 6 months. My father kept saying you'd forgotten all about me. He told me you were just a drifter who found a new girl in every new town. I refused to believe him. But then the letters stopped arriving from my end. I wrote you dozens of letters to that address in Abilene you gave me before you rode out. I never left Abilene for 6 solid months just waiting to hear from you," Caleb said, the awful truth finally dawning on him. "Someone was taking them." "My father," Lena whispered, the words catching in her throat. "He took them. He was desperate for Jedediah's money. He sold me, Caleb, but he made sure I believed that you had abandoned me first." The weight of that betrayal hit Caleb like a physical blow. All those wasted years, all that anger and bitterness. It was all built on a cruel lie spun by a greedy, selfish old man. He looked at Lena, really saw her for the first time, and he could see the young girl he had fallen in love with, trapped inside the body of a woman who'd been wronged by every man she had ever put her trust in. "I never stopped," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. He moved closer, stepping into her space. "I never stopped loving you. I spent 10 years hating you, and I still loved you every single one of those miserable days." Lena looked up at him, her breathing shaky. "Caleb." He reached out and cupped her face with his calloused hands. Her skin was warm against his touch. She leaned into his hands, a quiet sob finally escaping her. "We can't go back and change the past," Caleb whispered, gently brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "But we can sure as hell fight for our future. I'm not running away this time, Lena. I'm staying. For this land, for that gold. But mainly for you." He lowered his head and she rose up to meet him. Their lips finally met, not shyly, but with a desperate hunger, a kiss that had been waiting 10 long years. It tasted of salt and sorrow, and of a hope so bright it was almost frightening. But the moment was shattered by the sudden sound of hoofbeats pounding toward the house. Jubal's voice yelled from the barn, "Riders coming in fast!" Caleb pulled away from her, and the softness in his eyes was instantly replaced with hard steel. He drew his pistol. "Get inside," he commanded. The war for the Double M Ranch wasn't over. It was only just beginning. They didn't come for the house. There was no need. Instead, they moved through the lower pasture like a wildfire. From the dark parlor window, Caleb and Lorena could only watch the bobbing torches slice through the night. The crack of rifles echoed in the distance, not aimed at them, but at their herd. The panicked bellows of cattle filled the valley, soon followed by the thunder of hooves as the herd stampeded through the busted southern fence. "They're not trying to kill us," Jubal growled, working the action on his Winchester. "They're aiming to break us. That herd was every last liquid dollar we had from the will." Caleb slowly lowered his Colt pistol. He clenched his jaw so tight it hurt. "If the cattle are gone, we can't show any profit. If there is no profit, the bank will tell the probate court we mismanaged the place. Hayes gets everything without ever firing a shot in our direction." "We can't fight them," Lena said, her voice stripped of fear and full of cold reality. "There have to be 20 of them out there, and there are only 3 of us. If we ride out there, we're just riding to our graves." The night dragged on, a long torture of noise and distant fire. When the sun finally rose, the Double M Ranch was eerily quiet. The corral stood empty. Every head of cattle was gone, either scattered deep into the Badlands or driven off by Vargo's crew. The ranch was, for all intents and purposes, dead. But the gold was still there. The 3 of them sat around the kitchen table, nursing mugs of bitter coffee, and the morning sun exposed the deep lines of exhaustion on their faces. Jubal was methodically cleaning his rifle. Lorena just stared at a map spread across the table. "We have 3 days until that inspection," Lorena finally said. "With the herd gone, this ranch is worthless on paper. We can't cover that $3,000 lien." "We still have the nuggets," Caleb said, glancing toward the floorboards that concealed their stash. "There are 5 pounds of raw gold down there. That should fetch close to $1,500. It's only half of what we need, but it might buy us some time." "Not in this town, it won't," Jubal spat. "You take that gold to the assay office in Purgatory Creek, and the clerk will send word straight to Hayes. He will claim it was high-graded from one of his own claims. Then he will have the law impound it." "Then we don't go to Purgatory," Caleb said. "We'll ride to Cheyenne to the federal assay office. Hayes's influence doesn't reach the United States Marshals." "Cheyenne is a 2-day ride from here," Lena pointed out. "And going through Black Rock Canyon means riding straight through ambush country." "It's the only chance we have," Caleb insisted. Before they could argue it out, the sound of an approaching buggy made them all go quiet. Caleb crept to the window. "It's the sheriff," he announced, "and he brought company." Sheriff Big Jim Taggart lumbered out of his buggy, flanked by 2 deputies holding shotguns. They stopped just at the foot of the porch steps. Caleb stepped outside, his hand hanging loose and ready above his pistol. "You're on my land, Jim, unless you're here to track down the men who ran off my cattle last night." Taggart stared down at his own dusty boots, shifting his big frame. "Can't say I saw any rustlers, Caleb, but I do have a warrant." "A warrant?" Caleb let out a harsh laugh. "For what? For me defending my own property?" "No," Taggart said. He jabbed a thick finger toward Jubal, who had followed Caleb onto the porch. "It's for him, Jubal Early." "What?" Jubal barked. "There is an outstanding warrant from 1878, Taggart read from a folded paper. "Horse theft over in Sweetwater County. The judge signed off on it this morning." "That was 10 years ago," Jubal yelled. "And those charges were dismissed. I've got the papers to prove it." "The courthouse burned down back in 80, Taggart said, his voice flat. "All those records were lost. This complaint was just refiled. You're coming with me, Jubal." "This is Hayes's doing," Caleb snarled, moving down the steps. "He's picking us apart one by one." The 2 deputies immediately brought their shotguns up, aiming them squarely at Caleb. "Don't you do it, son," Taggart warned, his own hand now resting on his revolver. "Don't make this ugly over some old horse thief. Let the law sort it out." "The law?" Lena's voice cut through the tension as she stepped outside. "There is no law out here, Sheriff. There is only Broden Hayes' checkbook." Jubal placed a calming hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Let it go, Caleb. I'm an old man. I can handle a few days in a cell. You two have a job to do." Jubal handed over his rifle and walked down the steps. While they were putting the cuffs on him, he locked eyes with Caleb. His gaze was clear. "Run," it said. "Run now." As the sheriff's buggy vanished down the long, dusty road, the silence on the ranch felt heavier than before. It was down to just Caleb and Lena. The odds had gone from bad to downright impossible. "We have to leave tonight," Caleb said, turning to Lena. "We'll take the back trails. Jericho is a fast horse, but he can't carry both of us all the way to Cheyenne at a dead run," Lena argued. "We'll take the buckboard wagon," Caleb decided. "We can hide the gold under some sacks of feed." "But if they find us on the road," Lena began. "They won't," Caleb promised, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. He took both of her hands in his. "I am not losing you again, Lena. Not to Hayes, not to anyone." Lena looked up at him, and for a second, the tough frontier woman softened. She reached up and touched the rough stubble on his jaw. "Then teach me," she said. "Teach you what?" "How to use that peacemaker of yours. I'm fine with a shotgun, but if we're out on the open road, I need to know how to fight the way you do." The rest of the afternoon was spent behind the barn. Caleb stood behind her, his arms around her to help her steady the big Colt .45. He adjusted her footing, her grip, and the way she aimed down the long barrel. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and the faint scent of lavender from her hair. With every shot, she flinched a little less. By the time the sun set, she could hit a fence post from 20 paces away. It was more than just target practice. It was them getting ready for a war. As darkness settled, they loaded the wagon. 5 pounds of gold wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside a hollowed-out sack of oats. They added a jug of water, some dried beef, and every last bullet they owned. Caleb hitched up the team of 2 strong draft horses. He tied Jericho, his saddle horse, to the back of the wagon. "Why are we bringing him?" Lena asked. "Insurance," Caleb answered grimly. They pulled out under the dark blanket of a moonless sky, avoiding the main road and heading straight for the sharp, broken outline of Black Rock Canyon. They were running for their lives, hauling a small fortune in gold, with an army of ghosts right on their trail. Black Rock Canyon was like a deep scar carved into the earth. It was a tight, winding pass with sheer granite walls that shot up 200 feet on both sides. It was the quickest way to get to Cheyenne. It was also a perfect death trap. The shadows in the canyon were so deep they seemed to drink the starlight, and the only sound was the crunch of the wagon wheels on the loose rock. Caleb pushed the team of horses hard, his eyes constantly scanning the canyon rim high above them. Next to him, Lorena held the Winchester tight, her knuckles showing white. In her heavy duster and wide-brimmed hat, she looked like a statue, but her eyes gave away the fear of a woman who knew she was being hunted. "It is too quiet," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Just keep your eyes up," Caleb murmured back. "We're almost at the anvil." They were getting close to a landmark known as the Devil's Anvil. It was a huge boulder that hung over the trail, creating a natural bottleneck. As they came around the bend, Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. The trail was blocked. A huge pine tree had been dropped across the path, its bare branches reaching out like a skeleton's hand. "It is a trap!" Caleb yelled, yanking back hard on the reins. From the high ridge, the dark was lit up by muzzle flashes. Bullets chewed up the ground all around the wagon, sending up little fountains of dirt. The led horse screamed and reared up as a bullet tore a line across its flank. "Get down!" Caleb shouted, pushing Lena down toward the floorboards. "They're behind us, too," she cried out, pointing back the way they came. 3 riders were closing in fast, blocking any chance of retreat. Caleb glanced at the steep slope of loose rock that went up the canyon wall to their left. It was far too steep for a wagon, but a horse, a good strong horse, might be able to make that climb. "We can't fight our way out of this," Caleb said, his voice hard. He grabbed the heavy sack of oats that held the gold, jumped from the wagon, and ran to the back to untie Jericho. "Caleb, what are you doing?" Lorena yelled as she scrambled down, still holding the rifle. You are taking the gold, Caleb said, heaving the heavy sack over Jericho's saddle horn and tying it down fast. Jericho can make it up that slope, the wagon never will. I am not leaving you here to be killed. You have to, Caleb insisted, grabbing her by the shoulders, his eyes burning with intensity. If they get this gold, Hayes wins everything. If you make it to Cheyenne, you can save the ranch. You can save us. Now ride, Lorena, ride! He lifted her by the waist and threw her up into the saddle. He slapped Jericho hard on the rear. Go! As Lena dug her heels into the horse's sides and charged up the dangerous slope, Caleb ducked behind the wagon. He pulled his Colt and started shooting, not aiming to kill, but to draw every gun and every bit of attention to himself. He watched as Vargo's men scrambled for cover, and that gave Lena the precious seconds she needed. He saw her reach the top of the ridge, a dark shape against the rising sun, before she disappeared over the other side. She was safe. Caleb turned his attention back to the fight, firing until the hammer of his pistol just clicked on an empty shell. The silence that came after was deafening. Vargo rode toward him slowly, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He looked at the abandoned wagon, then up at the tracks leading up the steep cliff. She's gone, Vargo spat, leaning down from his saddle to smash his pistol against Caleb's head. The world faded to black. Caleb woke up to the smell of stale cigars and the coppery taste of blood in his mouth. He was tied to a chair right in the middle of his own ransacked parlor at the Double M. Broden Hayes sat comfortably in Elias's old armchair, looking perfectly calm and collected. Vargo stood over by the window, puffing on a cigar. You put up a good fight, Hayes said, pouring himself a glass of water. But you completely missed the point, Caleb. You really think I care about a handful of gold nuggets in some little creek bed? Hayes got to his feet and ripped a painting from the wall, revealing a large surveyor's map that had been pinned up underneath it. Thick red lines were drawn all across the territory. Gold is heavy. It's a chore to mine, Hayes whispered, pointing to a spot on the map. But steel rails? That is where the future is headed. The Union Pacific is planning a new spur line right through the Teton Pass. They will need water for those big steam locomotives. Your father's property is the only route that makes any sense. Caleb just stared at the drawing. This was never about a simple property line. This was about building an empire. Hayes stood to clear $100,000 just by selling them the right-of-way. The surveyors are coming tomorrow. Hayes glanced at his pocket watch. You sign this deed over to me, and I will let you walk away from this. You refuse, and Vargo will put you in the cellar for good. And what about Lorena? Caleb's voice was a rough whisper. My men are already on her trail. She is not going to make it to Cheyenne. A cold dread washed over Caleb, but in that moment, he saw it. Through the grimy window behind Hayes, a small glint of light flashed from a faraway ridge. It was a reflection. Not from a stone, but from a looking-glass. She had not run to Cheyenne at all. She had circled back. Caleb looked straight at Hayes and managed a weak smile. All right, I will sign. Just hand me the pen. He had to give her one clean opportunity. The window suddenly shattered inward, spraying shards of glass everywhere. Vargo let out a scream as his leg gave out, a rifle slug having torn straight through his thigh. He crumpled to the floor as his pistol went skittering across the wooden planks. Caleb moved in a flash. He lowered his shoulder and plowed into Hayes's gut, hitting the banker and sending him into the wall like a runaway train. The air rushed out of Hayes in a great gasp, and the inkwell on the table tipped over, spilling black ink all across the fraudulent document. Just as Hayes began fumbling for the derringer he had hidden in his vest, the front door was kicked clean off its hinges. Lorena stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the blinding noon sun, the Winchester rifle still smoking in her grasp. She worked the lever, sliding a new cartridge into the chamber, and aimed it right at the banker's heart. "Drop it, Hayes," she ordered, her voice carrying the unshakable power of the land itself. Hayes was frozen solid. His eyes darted from the bleeding hired gun on the floor to the woman he had so foolishly underestimated, and then to Caleb, who was wiping a trickle of blood from his mouth with a fierce grin. The whole scheme was over. Sheriff Taggart showed up about 10 minutes later, his timing a little too convenient, but welcome nonetheless. With Vargo singing like a canary to save his own hide and the railroad map on the wall as proof of Hayes's plan to steal the estate, the sheriff had no other option but to put the richest man in town in iron cuffs. 3 days after that, Caleb and Lorena walked straight into the Federal Assay Office in Cheyenne. They did not sell the gold. They used it as collateral. They settled the lien for the full amount. With the entire debt wiped clean, they went back and negotiated a new railroad contract under their own conditions. The Double M Ranch was not just rescued. Its future was now guaranteed for many years to come. But later that evening, as the sun dipped below the sharp peaks of the Tetons, painting the sky with deep purples and soft oranges, Caleb saw Lorena standing on the porch. Her gaze was not on the gold receipt or the new agreement. She was just watching the wind make waves in the tall grass. Caleb came up quietly behind her, putting his arms around her waist. He set his chin on her shoulder, breathing in the smell of lavender and fresh rain. Their wealth did not come from the shiny metal in the earth, nor from the railroad tracks that would soon cross the valley. They were wealthy because the house at their backs was not some decaying monument to a bitter past anymore. It was finally a home. "Are you planning on staying?" Lorena asked quietly, her hand gently covering his. Caleb gave her a soft kiss on the temple, watching the first few stars pop out over Purgatory Creek. "I am through with running, Rhea," he whispered. "I am home for good." And that right there is the tale of Caleb and Lorena. It is a story about true grit, a little bit of gold, and a love that was just too stubborn to die in the dust. It goes to show you that sometimes the most valuable thing you could find out west was not something you dug up from the dirt, but the person who stood right beside you when things got dangerous. If you had a good time on this trip through the Old West, please go ahead and give that like button a click. It surely does help our little channel venture out further. Do you believe Caleb should have just sold the land, or did he make the smart play? I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments, and be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you will not ever miss another tale from the American frontier. Thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you on the next one. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.